Today we're going to be looking at the Qbit All-City, an ultra-compact travel stroller from GB. My first impression looking at the model was, oh, it's a better version of the Cybex EasyS. And after doing some research, I understood why. You see, both GB and Cybex, as well as Evenflow, CBX, Dino, and several others, are all owned by Goodbaby International, a multi-billion-dollar company incorporated in the Caymans and headquartered in Shanghai. As of 2015, Goodbaby International produces more than 100,000 strollers a day under 15 different brands and is the largest supplier of strollers to North America. Of course, none of this information is a direct measure of the performance of the Qbit All-City as its own model, but I find it interesting nonetheless, especially since many of the models that share key engineering features with the Qbit lie in widely different price classes. I'll ruminate a little more on this subject in the conclusion, but for now, we'll jump right into looking at the Qbit Plus, at how it's built, and how well it performs compared to the rest of the market. Starting off with a few stats. The Qbit Plus clocks in at 7.5 kilos and folds down to 27 by 42 by 58 centimeters, which is, unfortunately, not within standard carry-on guidelines. It can take up to 17 kilos in the seat and 5 kilos in its easily accessible shopping basket. As far as child comfort goes, we're pretty impressed with the Qbit seat, which has generous dimensions in several respects, incorporating both a long seat back and a high-position canopy, as well as a deep baseboard, a good-sized adjustable leg rest, and a sufficiently low-positioned footrest. Combined, these factors mean that the Qbit Plus will accommodate a wider variety of ages than a lot of the competition, and is suitable up to around 3 years old before it will start to feel really cramped. The seat also has a full recline, and though the canopy doesn't have extra extension, its coverage does provide sufficient sun protection. The textiles on the Qbit Plus are well padded and easy to remove for a wash, but do note that the fabric type is closer to that found on their car seats, and is a bit more susceptible to staining than other textile types. Folding-wise, the Qbit is more or less identical to the Cybex EasyS, and when functioning as intended, is very easy, folding down and up with one hand. There are, however, mechanical weaknesses in its setup though, which we'll get to in detail in the mechanics section. When folded down, there is unfortunately no inbuilt method for carrying the Qbit Plus, like a handle or shoulder strap, but then, of course, it is an ultra-compact, so it's not that heavy anyway if you're just throwing it in the trunk at least, and don't intend to carry it for any length of time. When it comes to driving, the Qbit All-City is also quite nice, with large wheels both in the front and the back, as well as more suspension than is commonly found on ultra-compacts. And while you should still mainly stick to smooth urban terrain, it will manage to tackle somewhat rougher ground, like cobblestones and gravel, when you must. Note that its positive driving characteristics are limited to the All-City variant, as the quote-unquote all-terrain version has a dual wheel setup, and despite what they suggest, will actually function poorer on both urban and rough terrain. Okay, let's move on to the mechanics then, top to bottom. Okay, we're going to start by having a look at the folding system, and on ultra-compacts in particular, the folding system really determines the overall structure of the chassis, since you're trying to fold it down as small as possible. So the way that the Qbit folds is here on the handle. You have a little safety button here. Depress that, and then you pull on the main button, and that's going to unlock this central point here and allow all of the hinged points along the chassis to then bend so that it can fold down, at which point that central point there will lock again. Now, as I said, this is a commonly seen setup not only on Cybex EasyS and EasyS Twist, but also on CBX E2 models, as well as several other models from other brands, not all directly under the Goodbaby umbrella, but undoubtedly in strategic partnership and patent sharing relationships. Since it's such a widespread folding system, we've had ample opportunity to see it break. And as far as the Qbit All-City goes, I can say that there are three main weaknesses with the system. Number one, within this basic setup between the central button and the central singular locking point here, there are wires in order to activate, from this mechanism to activate the other mechanism. These wires are attached with very small plastic parts. And as the stroller gets looser and can start to develop symmetry problems over time, I have very often seen either the wire or those plastic connection points break. So there's like an internal complexity that often leads to breaking, and it's very hard to take apart the system and get a hold of parts and repair it if this occurs. Number two, and the key problem with this model in general, but especially in relation to the folding system, is this single central locking point on either handle. The reason for that is because since everything else is hinged, all of the pressure is going to go to this point, and it's not built that particularly sturdily inside. It also contains a lot of small, fragile parts, and it's responsible for taking all the kinetic energy from the bumps as you push while it's upright. As well, when it's folded down, it's responsible for holding the entire stroller locked together. That means that if you're not careful every time when you lift it up after you fold it down, and you pick it up by the bars here or the bars here, you're going to be pulling apart this angle here and thus putting more pressure and wear on those small internal mechanisms. And over time, that will eventually lead to problems. We've seen that happen many times before. The third main problem is that those hinged points along the rest of the chassis are predominantly riveted together, so there's no means of screwing them tighter. If you would use screws, you could screw them tighter when they start to loosen. And as those various hinged points start to loosen, because the rivet itself grows weaker, you're again going to have more like looseness and rickety problems, and it will lead to asymmetries that will then again put more pressure onto that central locking point, causing it potentially to fail. We're going to have a little bit of a closer look at the lower rear frame of the Qbit then, and the rear frame is actually one of the nicer points of the Qbit Plus All-City, partly because its design, at least as far as the suspension and brake system are concerned, is virtually identical to that found on much higher priced Cybex models like the Balios, the Priam, and the Mios. And it is also more or less the same on a number of models from Goodbaby's other brands as well, by the way. So they've put the sort of back frame bar with the suspension and the brakes that they're using on a lot larger, more premium models. So when you're looking then at this rear frame, one immediate effect of what they've done back here is that, again, it's going to have the ability to tackle some degree of terrain. It's still an ultra compact, so it's not going to be like a big terrain model, but these larger than average back wheels and this larger suspension unit here is going to give you the ability to go over some dirt trails and some gravel and cobblestones and so on when you have to. In addition to this, they've used this brake system, again, the same as on a lot of Cybex models. The brake system has sort of some positives and some negatives. So the positive side of this is that it has this very simple rotating bar system. And this rotating bar system, as opposed to like a wire-based system, means that you don't have as many small components and of course the wires themselves that can break and have problems later on. The negative part about this brake system that I've seen on several other models and comment on in every review is that the pin itself is not made purely of metal, but it's like a smaller metal pin surrounded by plastic, and this does have a tendency to get hung up sometimes when you're trying to release the brakes. It also will, of course, wear down a little bit faster than if that was purely made of metal. It can also bend a little bit easier than if it was purely made of metal. These are like longer term issues that can occur with the brake system. So positive in the middle, kind of negative on the pins. The one last note that I'd like to make on the back end is this support bar here, which I think is done right, and I think a lot of models don't do this right. So when you have to have this kind of smaller extra support bar here, a lot of people just rivet that to the outside, like inner facing of the chassis itself, and in this case it's actually been fitted up inside these bars. That's not a big deal, but it's just something I wanted to mention because I've seen it done wrong a lot of places, and that kind of speaks to a little bit more intelligent engineering with the crossbar. Okay, we're going to have a little bit of a closer look at the lower front end then, starting with the wheels themselves, which again are a little bit larger than average, which is quite nice. The setup of the fork and the suspension of the fork is like very common to do this sort of suspension and fork, but it is a little bit more heavy duty than you do find on some other models, and it is very much following the same design that you see across other Goodbaby models, again, particularly in the Cybex range and particularly with the like higher level or higher cost Cybex models. One thing that I really do like about the front end here and the front forks in general, which is surprisingly better on this model than it is on much more expensive like Cybex Priam and those sorts of models, is the way that the front fork actually fits into the front housing, because it has multiple points at which it's being held in order to prevent the axle from doing damage inside the housing, which is something that occurs over time and can eventually lead towards wobbly wheel problems. So you have your locking point here in the center, and then you have two additional sort of like extra circumference points. You have this lip here, so that means it's being held at this circumference as well as at the axle circumference, right? Then you have a second lip here, and then you also have an O-ring, and what the O-ring is going to do is to put a little bit of pressure as that fork locks into place, and again deal with some of that kinetic energy so that that axle doesn't wear down the housing inside there. So that was actually quite intelligently done, and I am a little bit surprised that they did this on a cheaper model, sort of Goodbaby as a conglomerate, right? As opposed to the higher priced Cybex models. One last note, something I'm a little bit less satisfied with, is the crossbar here, which is like also serves as the footrest, right? And the reason for that is that it has 2 points, 2 hinge points that are connected to it, one here and one here. And this one actually is a screw, so you could tighten it if you have trouble, if it starts to loosen down. But this one is not, and it's a relatively weak riveted point. And the fact that there are 2 hinged points there mean that I think 2 hinge points on either side mean that I think this is going to be one of those areas of the stroller that is going to loosen up first and lead to those sort of asymmetry problems that contribute to problems with that central locking point later on after a few years of use, especially if you use it a little bit harder. So, should you consider buying the Qbit Plus All-City? Despite a variety of legitimately positive factors like its well-proportioned seat, strong drivability, and relatively low price, even when considering that the rain cover is not included, I would unfortunately say no, for 2 key reasons: limited use value and limited longevity. By limited use value, I'm mainly referring to the fact that the Qbit Plus All-City's folded dimensions exceed carry-on guidelines, to such an extent that it's really unlikely to be accepted on any airlines as such. And if you need to check it anyway, then there are several other models also failing these guidelines which will outperform the Qbit. By limited longevity, I'm mostly concerned with the problematic folding system that I explained earlier. It's not much use to have a great seat and wheels if the faults in the folding system make the stroller unusable after a couple of years. In my mind, these 2 negatives sort of leave the Qbit Plus All-City without a country. You could buy it as a limited use until it breaks travel model, but then if that's what you really want, you might as well go even cheaper. In researching Good Baby International for this review, I found several models from a range of brands which all make use of more or less the same problematic folding system. And this made me think about differences in corporate strategy and how they impact the evolution of stroller mechanisms. From what I've seen working with manufacturers and distributors, you really need a focused after-sales department tasked with collecting data and plotting improvements directly into production in a continuous fashion if you want the design of a given model to improve. But if you're producing the same folding or brake system, say, for multiple models over 3 or 4 brands, compounded by the fact that a lot of them are sold cheap, meaning that there's less impetus for hustling to deal with specific problems quickly and plug the changes back into the manufacturing process, then it seems to me that progress will probably move much slower, and will also be highly affected by manufacturing cost pressures. In any case, we hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, we'd like to ask you to subscribe, as it helps us to make more videos in the future. Also, if any of you out there find our channel particularly useful and want to help out with a donation on Patreon, we would also really appreciate it. It will help us to grow faster, which means we will be able to release a wider variety of models and reviews at a quicker rate. Thanks for watching.